Okay, are you guys seeing the, oops, looks like it's going too far. All right.
Looks good.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for inviting me, Stefan. I just want to preface this talk by mentioning that all of this work was done prior to me joining Pareto Labs. So this was all done at BASF, where I was a computational chemist in my previous role. Okay, guess I'll have to use my mouse. Okay, oops. What is going on? Okay, so I wanted to start this talk with just addressing one of the big challenges I believe is for material scientists today, which is to try to be able to synthesize polymers for a wide variety of compositions, topologies, as well as functionality. And one of the grandstanding challenges, I believe, is being able to tune these polymers based on these types of characteristics for any type of design application at hand. Although today, what I will be presenting is primarily just focusing on a single topology, perhaps the most popular topology, which is the linear copolymers. And specifically, I'll be discussing ways in which we'd like to be able to design linear and random copolymers for any type of product application. Don't know why my computer is doing this. Okay, so when it comes to industrial applications, I just wanted to give scope some brief description about how a material scientist would go about synthesizing polymers in the lab. In general, they'd start off with something like 4 different monomers, or perhaps a selection of monomers. I've just labeled them as A, B, C, and D for simplicity. And by no means do they actually use these types of chemistries. Those are there just for example. They would then go ahead and select some of these monomers, try to synthesize polymers based on specific chain lengths, and then put them into some type of formulation, as you folks here on the call probably already know. And when it comes to molecular properties of these polymers, they'd have to satisfy certain conditions. In the case, or in the project that I was working with at the time, my project partners were interested in designing polymers that behaved as dispersants for automotive coatings-based applications. And so the idea here was to design polymers so that they would adhere onto pigments or pigment surfaces, pigments of which are used in the coloring of paints. And secondly, these polymers would also have to be able to sterically stabilize these pigments in the suspension. So what I mean by that at a fundamental level is these polymers had to repel from one another while adhering onto the surface of the pigment. And in turn, the lab scientists could then be able to design things like paint formulations that could adhere onto the surfaces of walls quite well, or they could do things like tune the optical qualities of the polymer material. Again, by controlling things like the particle size, in which case they can tune the diffraction index or fraction index of their material. So coming back to this just design problem where we have this linear polymer, if I were to potentially look at just a 20 mer copolymer as an example, and just being able to synthesize this polymer with just 4 different monomer types, there's a combinatorial explosion of possible polymers that could be sequenced if I were to be able to synthesize these polymers just by controlling sequence alone. So 20 polymers, as many of you know, is not much of a polymer at all. I'm sure some of you would say this is a oligomer, but this is just a simple proof of concept problem that I wanted to address. So when it comes to computational chemist's perspective, the way in which they would go ahead and tackle this problem would be to essentially run high throughput virtual screening. In general, polymers in large companies can be simulated using a supercomputer, and you would, if depending on which type of specific scientific domain you belong to, you would run the type of simulation that would simulate the properties of interest for these polymers. So in my case, when I was back at BASF, what we did was use molecular dynamics simulations to simulate things like the adsorption free energies of the polymers onto model pigment surfaces, and then also quantify things like steric stability through metrics such as second virial coefficients. So once we simulated a whole number, generally we'd simulate hundreds, if not thousands of polymers. I mentioned already that for just a 20-mer polymer, you can have 80,000 possible sequences. So this is really just a small fraction of the potential polymers that we can look into. We go ahead and simulate these representative polymers and then try to rank them according to these performance metrics. Once we did so, we can then make these suggestions to the lab scientists to go ahead and synthesize in the lab. And in general, we sort of reiterate these process back and forth, rerun simulations, rank them again, make new suggestions to lab scientists once we got the experimental results. So coming back to this design challenge, what I do want to mention is that running thousands of simulations, well, more than 1,000 simulations, running thousands on the order of 1,000 simulations, even on a supercomputer, was just computationally intractable. I believe at the time when I ran these simulations for some of the project partners, it took roughly 10% of the compute power of our supercomputer for that year. And I definitely got some email complaints saying that I should not be using that much compute power. So yeah, even for me, that like running on the order of 1,000 polymers was just intractable. And so we had to devise new methods into ways in which we could explore this search space for polymer design. So I'm going to switch gears here and just go through the thought process of a machine learning applied scientist or someone who does more of the data science work at a company such as BASF. The way in which they would tackle this problem is to first construct the so-called design matrix or the X matrix, where you would generate your features for all your polymers. Every row for your polymer candidate would represent a unique polymer sequence, and every column would be each of the features of your polymer. So things such as characteristics of polymers that you would use to synthesize the polymer, for instance, monomer type, stoichiometric ratios, the concentration of the monomers, the chain length, as well as characteristics of their sequences. For instance, things like the number of clusters of a monomer type would be one type of feature for that as an example, and so on and so forth. You would add these different types of characteristics that characterize your polymer just at a very basic level, and use that as input columns into your design matrix. You could then plug that into your whatever model that you wanted to test out. Again, this is a regression problem. And then you would actually go about training your model based on your target variables of interest. So in our case, we were interested in these adsorption free energies, the second virial coefficient, and thirdly, the radius of gyration of the polymers. So these are sort of proxies into what we believed were molecular thermodynamic driving forces for the application products of interest. Of course, we'd love to just be able to simulate the direct application property, but that was not doable with the models that we had at hand. So in general, it's nice to be able to train machine learning models once you construct your covariate matrix or design matrix, and you have your response matrix as well. You'd want at least a few number, maybe like on the order of 100 points, to at least first train your model. Otherwise, you'd be prone to things like overfitting, or you'd be actually better left off with very simple models such as ordinary least squares regression. So I want to touch upon another sort of technique or a subdomain of machine learning that allows you to train a model with as minimal points as possible, so that you still maximally inform your model. And one of the popular ways in which one could go about doing this is by using a so-called Gaussian process regression model and using the technique known as active learning. So I mentioned Gaussian processes just because it's quite popular in academia. In practice, however, it's not very useful due to the fact that it scales in cubic order with the number of rows. But for proof of principle, it's a very commonly technique used to study approaches such as this. So the example here I'm showing you that applies Gaussian process active learning is a one-dimensional problem where you start off with a response function. What we're doing is we're training the Gaussian process model using a handful of points, as represented with the black points there. And the red point is the points at which we sample our search space iteratively. And after each iteration, we retrain the model. So in this case, this 1D problem, that red point is sampling the point at which the model sees the locale in which you have the highest uncertainty. And so each time it predicts where in which your search space you have the highest uncertainty, and you continuously retrain this. This is, of course, it can be applied without loss of generality to n-dimensional inputs. But when it comes to multiple targets, it starts to become you start to question how well can you sample different points in space, because you might have competing regions of search space that might have high uncertainty for one objective, whereas you might have low uncertainty in that same space for another objective. And so another technique I want to discuss, not so much machine learning based, which is just simple Pareto optimization. So I'm sure many of you have heard of this already. When it comes to materials design problems, Pareto optimization is quite common, or even real world applications. This type of optimization approach is quite popular due to the fact that it recovers the so-called trade-off between your multiple objectives. So what I mean by that is most real world problems don't necessarily have a single overall global solution to their optimization problem. In general, when you try to optimize for one objective, you might end up minimizing for another, and vice versa. And so the idea here is to recover the maximal possible for one objective while trading off for another. And so when you do that, you end up with this so-called Pareto Frontier. If I have a laser pointer, I know I'm going to need this later. So the red points here is the set of optimal solutions. So Pareto optimal generally has a solution, a set for its solution. This is called the Pareto Frontier or the Pareto Front. And the red points are the so-called optimal points, whereas the blue points here are your non-optimal. What I want to mention is that this algorithm is purely a classification algorithm. So it scales well for n-dimensional objective problems, and it's very easy to compute. There is no type of vanishing gradient types of problems. We're not computing gradients, so this is gradient free, and it's just a simple classification. Generally, it's done in a pairwise form. Why this is of interest to chemicals companies? For most chemicals companies, what they tend to do is use the same types of chemistries and use them to construct multiple types of products. So for example, when I go back to this coatings applications that I was mentioning earlier in the talk, we might have one product type that might be, say, good for automotive coatings, where it might be quite good in one objective, but bad in the other, where it's less important. But say for coatings that are used in construction materials, such as laminate flooring, perhaps that the second objective is more important, and we'd like to know how to optimize for that second objective. So you can see from a industrial perspective, this is very important due to the fact that you can maximize revenue by recovering this type of trade-off curve. So I wanted to now discuss the algorithm in which leverages both Pareto optimization and active learning. When I discussed this active learning algorithm, I mentioned how difficult it may be to sample search space when you have two different objectives, let alone two objectives that are competing with one another. So just going with this 2D example, what I'm showing you here are predictive means and predictive uncertainties in the shaded regions. And these dark borders here represent the points that were initially used as training. So the way in which one would go about implementing or using this algorithm is they would first try to see whether or not they can recover any sort of Pareto front from their search space using their sort of small initially trained machine learning model. For the points that don't have overlapping uncertainties with any neighboring points in this property space, we can then classify those points as Pareto optimal directly. So some of the points that were used in training for this very simple example turned out to be the Pareto optimal due to the fact that there are no uncertainties that overlap. However, for these two particular points, you can see that there are uncertainties. And for those points, we'd want to focus our attention to, because then we can more efficiently recover this Pareto frontier. And so Pareto active learning essentially allows you to sample those points that are sort of ambiguous and allow you to distinguish this Pareto frontier more efficiently while maintaining a certain level of confidence in your prediction of this front. So this is the basic idea. Instead of just sampling points with highest uncertainties, you end up sampling these the region at which you would predict to be close to the Pareto front. And you do this again in an iterative manner, as I've shown earlier in the sort of video of Gaussian process active learning. So I just want to say that we tested this result as sort of a proof of concept on our dispersant application problem. And in this case, what I'm showing you are all of our polymers that we studied. We ended up simulating properties for 3,200 different polymers. We looked at the radius of gyration, this absorption free energy, and this dimer repulsion free energy to quantify some of these properties of interest for dispersant-based applications. What I'm showing in this figure is all polymers in property space, represented by all the gray points. If you look closely, you can see each of these points represent an individual polymer. The points in magenta are the points that we sampled in the algorithm after initially training a simple model, a simple machine learning model. And again, these are iteratively sampled. So every time we sample a new point in magenta, we then retrain our model. The points in stars are the points that ended up being classified as what we call epsilon Pareto optimal. So this epsilon is just a buffer for how accurate we are with our classification. And the points outlined here are just two-dimensional projections. So here, along with the points outlined in red and in blue, those correspond to all of the same points. Again, these are two-dimensional projections on the 2D planes. And we're just showing for clarity how our classified optimal compares to the true optimal. And you can see that it's not too far off. We are within the error tolerance of our parameter epsilon. So this is just to say that this sort of algorithm works quite well. it helps us simulate things much faster, which leads me to perhaps the key findings. And so here I'm just showing a plot where we are looking at, after each iterations, how well we've classified whether our polymers are Pareto optimal or not. I mentioned we initially started off with roughly 3,000 polymers that we've gone ahead and simulated these molecular properties for. And you can see after roughly 20 to 40, we almost recover 20 to 40 iterations, we almost recover all of the Pareto optimal polymers. Perhaps after 60, we recover all of them, and we're able to discover these polymers. So in total, we only needed to evaluate somewhere within 100 to 200 polymers rather than the entire 3,200. So if we were to compare this to, say, random search, this would approximately equate to 4% of the iterations needed. And so this is much faster than just simply doing random sampling. So all of this work that I just presented is published already. It was published last year. And the code for this algorithm is also available on GitHub, currently maintained by Kevin, who's one of the authors on this work. Okay, so just to conclude, I wanted to mention again, we've only addressed a very small subset of linear copolymer topologies. Not only that, we didn't even look at the entirety of our sequence space. I've only mentioned we've looked at 3,200 different polymers. We did not look at all 80,000, say, polymers for 20-mer copolymer. Again, these are reasons for this is due to the fact that even that type of search space is computationally intractable even with some of these approaches. So I believe there's a lot to explore here. I do want to mention that some of the work that we were continuing to work on was trying to improve our models. So our coarse grain models were more or less limited to n-mers of length 100. We could not go beyond that because then we would have to simulate a much larger system. And so some of the work that we were working on before I left was to try to improve our modeling techniques so that we can access more longer length and time scales for polymer systems, and while maintaining all atomistic resolution information from atomistic systems. And so this was some exciting work led by Nick, who's currently at BSF now. And the idea here was to try to get better models to access longer length and time scales so that we can explore all sorts of topologies of polymers. I think there's also quite a lot to do in terms of the machine learning side of things where we can, rather than featurizing polymers based on sort of higher level properties, we can actually try to featurize them in more of a continuous way, more specifically using things like graph embeddings that can sort of construct these polymers based on their graph structure. I think there's a lot to do there. And finally, I just wanted to discuss there's also improvements that can be made in terms of even the retraining of the model, where sometimes things like bias might end up influencing the model convergence times. And so how, for instance, how you initialize your training could really impact the final results of this type of algorithm. There's also one thing to note also is that we simulated all polymers in our study sort of as a proof of concept, and then simulated this sort of scenario as if we had gone ahead and performed active learning in a live manner. But in practice, it turns out this type of technique is really hard to do. And so there's all sorts of startups that just specialize in ML ops. so that you can actually retrain your model without having issues later on. So I think there's also a lot of work to do in this area. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Kevin, who's currently a PhD student at EPFL, an intern at the time, Gary Prasad, who was also an intern at the time, who's now at Henkel, a colleague at BSF, Shifeng, and Kevin's advisor, Berend at EPFL. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Brian. There are a couple of questions coming up in the chat.
Yep.
I think the first one is from Floor. So she writes, very interesting work. Thank you very much for the presentation. In terms of the polymer adsorption, did you consider the possibility of chemisorption, or is it only physisorption that is relevant in these systems?
Yeah, so to answer your question directly, yeah, it's all physisorption. Most molecular dynamics, unless you're using something like ReactFF, just tend to be physisorption when we run these free energy calculations.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Paola Carbona, and the question is, thank you, very nice and interesting talk. I did not understand how you reduced the number of polymers to model from the thousands to hundreds. Also, are these polymers solutions or melt?
Good. Yeah, great question. I did forget to mention that the systems that we simulated are in solution. Not only that, the thermodynamic properties that we were simulating was essentially done in infinite dilution. So it's not melt. Yeah, we're making these very, very big assumptions there. When we reduce the number of polymers from thousands to hundreds, what I mean by that is when we initially started off with 3,200 different polymers that we can characterize, with the active learning algorithm, and I might actually answer the next question, we initialize, had we not simulated all 3,200, the way you would go about doing this is just simulate, say, 100 initially, get all of these properties for that 100, and then iteratively sample your entire search space more smartly. So just try to sample the search space so that you recover that Pareto optimal. And what essentially this figure is showing is that only after 60 more points, so in total, say 160 points, you can evaluate these properties for all 3,200 polymers. I hope that made sense. And so to answer the next question, it's roughly on the order of 100 to 200, or I guess from 100 to 200 polymers that we've used for training.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and we're like 1 minute before time, so I think that's a good point to switch to the next one.